The moderator called her name, and Nadia Reyes walked to the front of the room at a pace that refused to hurry. She set her notes on the podium, looked out at the assembled investors, and introduced herself, fully without omission, as the founder and chief executive of Novastar Energy Solutions, a company with nearly $1 billion in valuation. She watched Rodrigo's face drain of color from across the room. She did not rush past the moment. She cited the timeline, the contracts, the documented facts, her voice steady and precise as a surgeon's hand. She had spent 5 years making herself invisible to protect something she believed was love. 3 weeks of truth had revealed what she had actually been protecting, his convenient fiction. She concluded by saying the room deserved accurate information. Then she stepped back from the podium and walked toward the door, not quickly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has finally allowed herself to be seen. The city had barely opened its eyes when Nadia Reyes carried her morning coffee to the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse and stood in the silence that existed between two lives. Outside, the skyline was still wrapped in pale blue haze, the kind of early light that made everything look unfinished and full of possibility. Inside, on the marble counter, her phone had already accumulated 11 notifications from 3 time zones. Board confirmations, a contract update from her Singapore liaison, a flagged message from her CFO about a government tender in the Netherlands requiring her sign-off before 9. She answered none of them yet. That hour belonged to the time after her husband left for the day. Nadia had built Novastar Energy Solutions from a $15,000 loan, 2 second-hand laptops, and a storage unit rented by the month. 11 years later, Novastar held active contracts with municipal governments, private infrastructure developers, and industrial manufacturers across 14 countries. Its most recent valuation stood at $940 million, climbing steadily toward $1 billion. By every professional measure, she was one of the most consequential figures in the global clean energy sector. Her husband of 5 years, Rodrigo, did not know any of this. When they had first met at a rooftop fundraiser for an environmental nonprofit, she had introduced herself simply as a technology consultant. That description was not entirely false. She consulted. She made decisions that shaped outcomes affecting thousands of employees and hundreds of millions in annual revenue. She had simply omitted the specifics. Something about Rodrigo in those early weeks had made her want to be known as a person before being known as a portfolio. He had a warmth to him, a genuine enthusiasm for sustainable design that felt unperformed. She fell for him before finding a natural moment to correct the record, and then the moment passed, and seasons changed, and what began as an omission hardened quietly into structure. She watched him emerge from the hallway now, distracted, adjusting his jacket lapels with the focused energy of someone preparing for a performance. He kissed her cheek without fully pausing his internal rehearsal. "Big presentation this morning, the Caldwell Group. If this goes well, it changes everything for the firm." "You'll be wonderful," Nadia replied. She meant it, always, with the particular complexity of someone who loves a person clearly while grieving the distance between who he was and who he had chosen to become. What she did not say was that the Caldwell Group had been a Novastar client for 8 months. She had personally reviewed their sustainability commitments in a meeting room across the city, at a table she had ordered, and a presentation she had approved. Rodrigo would be walking into a room full of people who already knew her name, even if they did not yet know her face. After the door closed behind him, she picked up her phone and joined her morning briefing. The work was waiting, as it always was. She had built something extraordinary in the hours her husband believed she spent on small, inconsequential things. Today would be no different. Yet beneath the discipline and routine, she was slowly becoming aware of a restlessness she could no longer fully manage, the particular unease of someone who has been invisible for too long and is beginning to remember what it felt like to be seen. It arrived the way most unwelcome truths do, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a small, quiet disturbance in the surface of ordinary life. Nadia had been reviewing quarterly projections on a Tuesday afternoon when her phone buzzed with a message from her closest friend, Paloma. No text, only a link and 3 question marks arranged like an understated alarm. She clicked, expecting industry news. Instead, she found a photograph posted to a public social media profile. Rodrigo was in the image, his arms settled comfortably around a woman she had never seen, standing outside an upscale restaurant with the relaxed ease of 2 people who had done this many times before. The caption was cheerful and entirely public. The location tag placed them at a coastal resort 3 hours from the city on a Saturday when Rodrigo had told Nadia he was attending an urban planning symposium. She set her coffee cup down on the desk with the deliberate care of someone managing a sudden tremor in their hands. She did not react immediately. She had spent 11 years building a company, and the habit of gathering complete information before forming conclusions was not something she could simply set aside. She went back through her memory the way she approached financial discrepancies, looking for patterns rather than isolated moments, assembling data points into a picture rather than reacting to a single piece of evidence. What she found, once she began looking that way, was more than she had expected. Late evenings described as client dinners that produced no visible new clients. A weekend visit to a college friend whose name changed slightly between retellings. A regularity in how Rodrigo announced his whereabouts, a specificity that felt rehearsed, the kind of detail someone provides after preparing the explanation in advance. She had noticed each of these individually and assigned innocent explanations to all of them. That was what trust looked like from the inside. It looked like the repeated decision not to add things up. Now she was adding them up. The woman in the photograph was named Celeste Varga, according to the social profile attached to the post. 28 years old, lifestyle content creator with nearly 50,000 followers. A curated feed of designer goods, expensive meals, and intimate moments posed for an audience. Nadia scrolled through 3 months of posts with the dispassionate focus of a researcher cataloging data. Rodrigo appeared in 9 of them, always recognizable by something specific. The watch she had given him for their 3rd anniversary, the angle of his shoulders when performing ease rather than feeling it, the restaurant booths and hotel lobbies appearing in backgrounds on evenings she now understood differently. 3 months, long enough to establish habits, private vocabulary, and a shared architecture of small deceptions. Long enough for this to carry weight and intention rather than representing a single lapse in judgment. Nadia closed the tab, reopened her financial model, and stared at the numbers without seeing them for several minutes. Then she saved her work, opened a new document, and began taking notes. She needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with before deciding how to respond. Acting on partial information was a mistake she had made once in her 3rd year of business, and she had spent considerable energy ensuring she would not make it again. Nadia retained a private investigations firm she had used twice before during corporate due diligence processes. The firm was discreet, methodical, and expensive, qualities she had found to be reliably correlated. The lead investigator was a composed woman named Diane, who communicated in plain language and delivered findings without editorial embellishment. Nadia appreciated this. She did not need her grief managed. She needed accurate information. Diane's preliminary report arrived 4 days later in a password-protected file. Nadia read it at her desk with the door closed, bringing the same focused attention she gave to complex financial documents. She read it twice. The findings were thorough and without mercy. Rodrigo had opened 2 credit accounts Nadia had not previously known about, both registered solely in his name, both carrying balances that documented a second life built in careful parallel to their shared one. The transaction history detailed restaurants she had never been invited to, boutique hotel stays on evenings accounted for by other explanations, and a purchase from a private jeweler that did not correspond to anything he had ever given Nadia. There was also an apartment lease on the east side of the city, 12 months into a 2-year term, paid in monthly cash withdrawals from a personal account she had not previously traced. He had been careful about it. He had opened the accounts separately, withdrawn cash in amounts below alert thresholds, and maintained the apartment under a residential lease that kept it off obvious paper trails. She might have found the organizational effort impressive if it had not been constructed entirely for concealment. What occupied her attention more than the practical architecture of the deception was the assumption underneath it. Rodrigo had built all of this confident that his wife would never look. He had operated with the assurance that the woman who stayed home and spoke warmly about her modest consulting work would not have the initiative, the resources, or the professional contacts to uncover anything he chose to hide. His entire parallel life had been constructed on the foundation of her perceived smallness. She held that thought for a long time. She had chosen to appear smaller than she was. That had been a deliberate decision made in good faith, a choice to protect the authenticity of the relationship by removing wealth and status from the equation. She had wanted Rodrigo to know her without those things. What she had not fully considered was that removing them did not simply simplify the picture. It also created a vacuum that his assumptions rushed in to fill. In the space where her real self should have been visible, he had installed a convenient fiction, and that fiction had given him permission to treat her accordingly. That was not a straightforward thing to reckon with. She had contributed to the conditions of her own betrayal, not through weakness, but through a form of caution that had produced the opposite of what she intended. Hiding herself to protect love had ultimately prevented love from being built on anything real. She folded the report with precise care and placed it in the locked drawer of her desk. She was not ready to act yet, but she was very close, and she already knew what shape the response would take when she was. The Global Green Infrastructure Forum convened every 18 months and drew a specific cross-section of the clean energy world. Investors seeking credible projects, developers seeking capital, urban planners seeking both, and a surrounding ecosystem of consultants and emerging sector professionals who came to be seen as much as to listen. Rodrigo had mentioned it 4 times in the preceding 6 weeks, increasingly specific in his eagerness to attend. He had submitted a proposal for one of the afternoon breakout sessions and was still waiting to hear if it had been accepted. He was unaware that Novastar Energy Solutions was one of the event's 3 lead sponsors, and that Nadia's office had supported the logistics of the opening reception. She had not originally planned to attend. The idea formed gradually from a need that was less about strategy than clarity. She wanted to see who Rodrigo became when he believed he was unobserved, in the professional arena he considered most important, among people he was actively trying to impress. She entered the event as Isabella Montero, using a legitimate business identity connected to one of Novastar's international subsidiaries, a vehicle she occasionally used for exploratory meetings when she preferred not to lead with the company's full profile. She wore her hair differently, added glasses she didn't need, and dressed in the kind of precise, understated luxury her usual style deliberately avoided. She had spent years dressing down. It required surprisingly little effort to do the opposite. She found Rodrigo within 20 minutes of entering the main hall. He was circulating with practiced ease, pausing at clusters of conversations long enough to introduce himself and leave an impression before moving on. She watched him from across the room, noting the calculation behind what appeared spontaneous. He found her at the bar, which she had anticipated. "I don't believe we've met," he said, extending his hand with the confident warmth of someone who had delivered this opening many times. "Rodrigo Reyes, Sustainable Architecture and Design." "Isabella Montero," she replied, holding her voice at a slightly different register. "We represent a renewable infrastructure investment fund based in Lisbon. We are currently evaluating projects in this region." The effect was immediate and readable. His attention sharpened. He straightened slightly and shifted from casual charm to purposeful engagement. Over the following 90 minutes, Nadia sat beside her husband and listened to him describe his professional history in terms considerably more accomplished than reality. She watched him dismiss their shared life as the quiet backdrop to his real ambitions, referencing a supportive wife at home in a tone that communicated mild inconvenience rather than genuine affection. He was funny and polished and precise in the way people are when they have rehearsed a version of themselves for a specific audience. When he asked for her contact information before she excused herself, she handed him a business card with the steady composure of someone who had already made every decision that mattered. She walked away without looking back, moving through the ballroom as though she were any other attendee, nodding briefly at a colleague from her Singapore office who recognized her and had the grace to say nothing unusual. In the taxi back to the penthouse, she kept her hands folded in her lap and her breathing deliberate. She had come for confirmation and received it completely. There would be no more assembling of fragments or assigning of innocent explanations. She knew precisely what she was dealing with and precisely what she intended to do about it.
There is a specific and underappreciated difficulty in knowing the truth before you have spoken it. It is not the sharp pain of discovery, which at least carries the relief of clarity, but something slower and more wearing, the experience of carrying knowledge that will change everything while continuing to move through days that appear unchanged on their surface. For 2 weeks following the forum, Nadia lived inside that difficulty with the same discipline she had used to build her company, applied now to the harder work of maintaining composure while deciding what came next. She kept their shared routines intact. She cooked dinner on the evenings she was home. She asked about his projects with an attentiveness that remained genuinely habitual, because some part of her still held authentic interest in the man she had chosen, alongside the grief of what she now knew about him. She listened to him describe his day and contributed to conversations she understood to be only partially honest on his side. She watched him answer her texts with the easy fluency of someone performing a role he had long since internalized. She did not treat this as weakness. She had learned over 11 years of building something in an industry that regularly tested her resolve, that the ability to hold a position steadily while gathering information was not passivity. It was precision. Premature action closed options. She had made that mistake once during an acquisition negotiation and had never repeated it. She spent those 2 weeks in active preparation. She met with her attorney Patricia to establish a complete picture of her financial position within the marriage and the implications of a separation. She worked with Diane's firm to compile a final, verified record of Rodrigo's parallel activities. She reviewed the contractual relationship between Novastar Energy Solutions and the Caldwell Group to ensure her professional interests were fully documented independent of any personal proceedings. She also contacted the program committee of the Meridian Sustainability Showcase, a biannual industry event where emerging firms in sustainable design were given the opportunity to present to potential investors and partners. Rodrigo's architectural firm had submitted a proposal for one of the afternoon slots. The committee confirmed when she inquired that his proposal had been accepted and his presentation was scheduled in 11 days. Nadia asked whether there was capacity in the program for an additional speaker from Novastar Energy Solutions. The committee responded with warmth that space could certainly be made. Novastar was a recognized name in the sector. She drafted her own remarks that evening. They were honest, measured, and complete. She revised them 3 times over the following days, removing everything that felt like performance and keeping only what was true and necessary. She was not preparing a confrontation. She was preparing a correction. The difference between those 2 things was important, and she was determined to understand it clearly before she walked into that room. She also spoke with Paloma the evening before the showcase, briefly and without disclosing the full plan. Paloma, who had sent the original link and asked no intrusive questions in the weeks that followed, simply told her to wear the charcoal blazer because it made her look like someone who had already won. Nadia laughed properly for the first time in weeks. She went to sleep that night with the calm of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is ready to be done with the preparation. The Meridian Sustainability Showcase occupied the main conference hall of a hotel in the financial district. The room was arranged in the format of a professional pitch event, with a presentation stage at the front, round tables filling the floor seating investors and industry observers, and lighting that managed to signal both credibility and possibility. It was the kind of room Rodrigo had been working toward for years. Nadia arrived before him. She chose a seat near the back, away from main sightlines, in a position that allowed her to observe without being immediately visible. She wore her own face without alteration, her hair in its usual style, her clothing chosen for professionalism rather than transformation. There was no Isabella Montero today.
She had decided that the truest version of this moment required her to be entirely herself. She watched Rodrigo enter with the focused energy of someone who had spent days in careful preparation. He was dressed more deliberately than usual, his materials in order, scanning the room for familiar faces. She noticed the small physical adjustments he made as he settled, the collar check, the practiced calm assembled around himself like a garment. She had seen him do this hundreds of times and had always found it endearing. From this new angle, she saw it for what it was. His presentation ran 40 minutes. She gave him full credit where warranted. He was articulate, genuinely skilled at translating complex sustainability concepts into language accessible to non-specialists. His slides were well designed and his delivery confident. He described his firm's growing footprint in the renewable energy sector, citing several high-profile partnerships as evidence of established credibility. One of those partnerships, described in terms that positioned his firm as the primary initiating force, was with Novastar Energy Solutions. Nadia made a quiet note on the small pad she had brought. When the moderator introduced her as the afternoon's closing speaker from Novastar Energy Solutions, she walked to the front of the room at an unhurried pace. The moment Rodrigo's eyes found her face and registered recognition, she watched the color change in his complexion and a particular stillness settle over him. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked at the broader room. She introduced herself fully, by name and title. She described Novastar's origins and current scope with the practiced economy of someone who has explained something many times. Then she addressed, without drama or emphasis, the specific claims made in the preceding presentation regarding the nature of the relationship between the two organizations. She cited the documented timeline and Novastar's directing role in the work that had been characterized otherwise. She concluded simply by saying she believed the room deserved accurate information when making professional decisions. Then she stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat. The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then the room found its voice again, changed in a way everyone present could feel. Several investors exchanged glances. Rodrigo remained at the side of the room, very still, like a person standing in the aftermath of something that has not yet finished arriving. Nadia did not look at him again. She had said what needed to be said to the room that needed to hear it. The rest would happen elsewhere, in the corridor outside, in the weeks that followed, in the slow and necessary work of untangling what was real from what had been quietly taken from it.
She had expected him to find her afterward, so she positioned herself in the corridor outside the main hall where he could approach without an audience, but also without the protective distance of a phone screen. She owed him that. Whatever had been destroyed in the past months, they had shared 5 years before it, and she believed certain conversations deserved to happen in person. He came through the door 7 minutes after the session ended. His face carried an expression she had not seen on him before, something between the confusion of a person who has been caught and the resentment of one who believes the catching was unfair. "I don't know what you think you just accomplished in there," he said, keeping his voice low. "I corrected the public record regarding my company's work," Nadia replied. "That is a professional responsibility." "You humiliated me in front of every contact I have been building for 3 years. "I know about the apartment on the east side," she said. "I know about Celeste Varga. I have the financial records for the accounts you opened separately and the documented timeline of how you have been spending the money I deposited into our joint accounts. I have had this information for 3 weeks." The edge left his expression, replaced with something flatter. "I also want you to know," she continued, "that the woman you met at the Green Infrastructure Forum, the investor named Isabella Montero from Lisbon, was me. I wanted to see how you presented yourself and our marriage when you believed you were unobserved. You told that woman, who was your wife, that your home life was a quiet background to your real ambitions, that your spouse was a supportive but limited presence while you navigated the world that actually mattered. I need you to know that I heard every word of that." Around them, event attendees moved through the corridor in both directions, conversations flowing past their stillness. "Nadia," he said, and the way he said it carried a different quality, something lower and less defended. "I made choices I shouldn't have made.
I convinced myself that compartmentalizing things meant they weren't affecting what we had. I was wrong about that. I hid my company from you because I wanted our relationship to be based on who we actually were to each other, she said. I wanted to be known without the weight of what I had built. That was a genuine impulse. What I did not anticipate was that removing that visibility allowed you to decide who I was yourself. The person you decided I was did not deserve your honesty or your fidelity. That is what I am grieving. Not only the betrayal, but the years I spent believing that making myself smaller was the same as making love safer. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. My attorney will be in contact with yours before the end of the week, she said. I will not make this harder than it needs to be. I would appreciate the same in return. She walked toward the exit. The afternoon light outside was still and generous, and she stood in it briefly before getting into the car, breathing slowly and deliberately, allowing herself to be exactly where she was. The divorce proceedings occupied 4 months. Nadia's legal team approached the process with thoroughness and without aggression, which reflected her instructions. She wanted the financial record to be accurate, the settlement to reflect the actual origin of shared assets, and the process to conclude without extended conflict. After an initial period in which Rodrigo's legal team tested several positions, an agreement was reached that was equitable in the precise sense, meaning it corresponded to what was true rather than what either party could argue strategically. She moved into a smaller apartment near a public park on the south side of the city. People who knew her net worth found this decision puzzling. She did not explain it at length. The simple version was accurate enough. She had spent years arranging her visible life to reflect something other than her actual scale, and she did not intend to overcorrect in the opposite direction. The new space was comfortable, well-lit, and close to a coffee shop she liked and a bookstore she visited most weekends. It suited the life she was building rather than performing. Novastar had its strongest financial quarter on record that spring. The brief public visibility following the showcase had generated new inquiries from partners in 4 countries, 2 of which Nadia pursued through extended evaluation. She approved one partnership in the 3rd month and kept the other under review. The team she had assembled over 11 years was exceptional, and much of the company's momentum was now self-generating, driven by culture and people rather than requiring her constant direct intervention. She had built something with genuine structural integrity. She allowed herself, quietly, to feel the weight of that. She joined an advisory board for a neighborhood revitalization initiative in an underserved district of the city. The board met monthly and included residents, local business owners, nonprofit directors, and municipal planners alongside private sector representatives. The work required her to listen considerably more than she spoke. She had spent more than a decade in rooms where her perspective was the organizing principle around which others gathered. It was useful and genuinely humbling to sit in a room where her perspective was simply one among many equally weighted ones. She also resumed regular contact with her grandmother, the woman who had provided the original loan that made Novastar possible. The conversations between them had grown infrequent as the company expanded, and Nadia had come to understand that she had been treating the relationships that predated her professional success as stable background rather than as priorities requiring attention. This was an error of the same category as the larger one she had spent the previous year reckoning with, the assumption that love, like a well-structured company, would continue operating if you invested in it once and then directed your primary energy elsewhere. She turned 39 that summer and let Paloma arrange a small gathering on a rooftop. The guest list was 12 people. Everyone present knew her completely, without management or omission. And the lightness of that fact was something she could feel physically, the way you feel the absence of a weight you carried so long you stopped noticing it. It was the most uncomplicated evening she could remember in years, and she drove home afterward with the windows down and the particular satisfaction of someone who has finally arranged their life to match what they actually value rather than what they thought they were supposed to demonstrate. Marco Salinas ran a mobile health clinic network serving 4 neighborhoods in the city's historically underinvested southern corridor.
He had built the program over 7 years from a single retrofitted vehicle and a community foundation grant, expanding it through a combination of municipal contracts, private partnerships, and the kind of sustained organizational persistence that most people found exhausting, but that he appeared to regard as simply natural. He attended the Revitalization Advisory Board meetings with a notebook, a direct manner, and an uncomplicated willingness to disagree with people he thought were wrong, including people considerably more powerful than himself. Nadia noticed this almost immediately and found it clarifying rather than abrasive. Their acquaintance developed the way things develop when two people are focused on shared work rather than on each other. He challenged a resource allocation model she proposed in their second session together, not with the confrontational energy she sometimes encountered from people testing her authority, but with a specific, well-evidenced counterargument from someone who understood both the model and its limitations. They ended up in the hallway afterward, still talking, discovering that their apparent disagreement had been primarily definitional and that their actual positions were considerably closer than either had assumed. He invited her for coffee. They spent 90 minutes in a small place near the community center talking about structural inequities in municipal infrastructure planning, the undervaluation of community health outcomes in standard economic assessments, and a grant proposal he was preparing. Somewhere in that conversation, Nadia became aware that she was entirely present in a way that had felt unavailable to her for a long time. Several weeks into their friendship, she told him about Novastar. Not obliquely, not gradually, but directly, stating the company name, its scope, and its valuation in plain language. She was done arranging herself for consumption by others. If he recalibrated after knowing, she would learn something important. He did not recalibrate. He nodded with genuine interest, asked one specific question about whether Novastar had worked in community health infrastructure, and then returned to what they had been discussing, which was the evidence base for an intervention model he was considering. She found this so profoundly ordinary in the best possible sense that she looked out the window for a moment to collect herself. She did not move toward anything quickly. She had spent several months in conversation with a therapist who specialized in identity and relational patterns, and one of the cleaner insights that emerged from that work was that her habit of obscuring herself had not been incidental to what went wrong in her marriage. It had been structural. She had hidden herself to protect love, but love requires presence, and presence cannot be built on strategic absence. She would not repeat that pattern. Whatever she built next would be constructed from the beginning in the open, with the full and accurate version of herself present from the first day. This was not a reaction to Rodrigo. It was a decision made in genuine understanding of herself, and the difference between those two things was important enough that she intended to keep it clear. She had been invisible by design for long enough. The next chapter would be built differently, openly, with every part of herself present and accounted for from the very first conversation. She owed that not to any particular person, but to the version of herself she had been quietly protecting all along, the one who had built a billion-dollar company from a storage unit and a loan, and who deserved, finally, to simply be known.
2 years after the morning she had watched Rodrigo leave without knowing who had made his coffee, Nadia Reyes stood in the atrium of Novastar Energy Solutions' new headquarters and allowed herself a moment of uncalculated stillness. The atrium faced east and filled each morning with the kind of light that made glass appear to generate its own luminosity. The building had been designed as a demonstration project, net zero in energy consumption, solar integrated across its south facade, with a publicly accessible ground floor housing a clean energy exhibition and a community meeting space that local organizations could reserve at no cost. She had wanted it to be a statement about intention, not achievement, about what it looked like when resources were directed with genuine purpose rather than toward the accumulation of more resources. The opening event was public, which had required negotiation with her communications team. She had been firm about it. She wanted families to walk through the ground floor and understand where their electricity came from. She wanted the technical college students who had spent a morning with her operations team learning about grid integration to feel that the institution they had been studying was genuinely accessible to them. She wanted the advisory board members who had given her a year of honest, unglamorous community-level work to stand in a room that publicly reflected the values they had been applying together in smaller meeting rooms every month. Marka was near the entrance talking with her grandmother, who had traveled in for the occasion. Nadia watched them from across the atrium without joining immediately. Her grandmother was making a point with the characteristic directness that had always been one of Nadia's models for how to exist in the world. Marco was listening with the quality of attention that had first made her take notice of him, the kind that did not perform interest but simply had it. She crossed the room and arrived in the middle of a conversation about heirloom tomato varieties and the general decline in flavor in commercially produced produce. "She is completely correct," Nadia said, settling into the group without preamble. "I have been saying this for 3 years and no one takes it seriously." Her grandmother gave her a look of vindicated satisfaction. Marco met her eyes with the easy, uncalculated warmth of a person who is simply glad you arrived. Nadia had changed very little in the practical details of her life. She was still disciplined and methodical, still inclined to gather information before drawing conclusions, but she had stopped organizing her existence around managing how she appeared to others. She introduced herself correctly at every level now, with her name, her title, and the full scope of what she had built, offered without apology and without performance. She had discovered, not without some surprise, that the people worth knowing found this clarifying rather than overwhelming. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She read the message from her CFO, noted it, and put the phone away. The work was continuous and would still be there in 20 minutes. Right now, she was here, completely herself, standing in something she had built honestly and open to the world without reservation. It was, she had found, exactly enough. It had always been enough. The only thing ever missing was her own willingness to believe it.